Hello everybody, and welcome to this, my only video. I'm so used to saying first of two. On this, the Agfa Optima 1A, also called the Agfamatic 1A. Comes in this nice leather case. Tell you what, man, they do not make camera access. Well, I guess they do. I have a really nice leather case for my Leica, one of my Leicas that is brand new and is exceedingly well made. I'll tell you what, there's just something really nice about an old camera case as long as it's in good condition. So at any rate, the Agfa Optima 1A, or also called the Agfamatic 1A. This is a fully automatic, scale-focusing 35mm viewfinder camera. Okay, what does that mean? Let's go over all of that. Fully automatic means the camera's going to do the thinking for you and take the picture as it sees fit. We'll talk about what that means and how it does that in a bit. You can also override that, and we'll talk about how to do that as well during this video. Scale focusing means that it does not have marked distances in terms of feet or meters. It has symbols that tell you your distance. Now here there is an exception to that. Your close focus is 3.5 feet, which is 3.25 feet, which is 1 meter. But then you've got a portrait of two people, a group shot of a family, a shot of a mountain with what appears to be a church growing on it, and that is your infinity focus. So that's what they mean by scale focusing, is that instead of having numbers, they have a distance setup, and then your aperture will increase your depth of field, although your depth of field is not marked with scales. I know, it's confusing terminology. And by 35mm, what I mean is it can take any 35mm film you put in it. However, there are limits to what the light meter and shutter speed combinations and aperture combinations can do. So there is a fairly narrow ISO range on this camera that is actually usable with in terms of film speeds. It has a selenium cell light meter, which is this right here. Has a leaf shutter with a maximum automatic shutter speed of 1/160th of a second. So you can see, if you are familiar with film at all, you can take a pretty solid guess that the ISO range on this camera is not going to reach 3200. The shutter speeds that it has available are automatic, which is 1/160th of a second. Bulb, which is you push the shutter button down and it starts taking a picture. When you release the shutter button, it stops taking the picture and the shutter leaves close. And 1/30th of a second. Now, that's actually kind of limiting, isn't it? Yeah, it is. And that's okay. There's an aperture to help control your exposure with, and we'll go over how to use that. In automatic mode, the camera will fire at 1/160th of a second and then select the best aperture based on the light meter reading. So I guess realistically it'd be best to call this a shutter priority camera rather than an automatic camera. But the term automatic was contemporary to when these were made. Shutter priority came about some decades later. The flash sync on this camera is only 1/30th of a second and bulb. And what that means specifically is that in auto mode, the flash will not trigger on this camera. It will only trigger in the flash settings or the bulb settings. And when we look at the lens, we'll go over how to read those symbols on it and what they all mean. The target market for this camera would have been the entry-level user. It takes a lot of the complexity out of photography. It really does strip down the photographic experience to a very basic and user-friendly level. So if you are curious about picking up an easy-to-shoot with camera that has some controls but doesn't need a whole lot of thought, that's this one. And so we can tell by that it was designed for people who weren't looking for a very complex, super technical photographic experience like an advanced user would be more prone to want to find. It has a relatively slow lens, which is a 45mm lens with an f2.8 aperture. It has a limited ISO range of 10 to 200, and we can see that up here. 200 ASA and ISO are the exact same thing. So 200 ASA is 200 ISO. I guess maybe you could probably, nope, you cannot push this up past 200 because it won't let you dial any further. Will it? I am not strong enough to turn this without a coin. Yeah, you can maybe get it to 250. I would not push it that far. But you can, using a coin, get it down to as slow as 10. So that's your film speed range right there. It is a lightweight camera made with stamped metal construction and a plastic interior. And that, I think, for me was the biggest surprise about this camera when I opened it up the first time. I was like, everything's plastic. I thought this camera was too old for everything to be plastic, but it's not. So that does make this an incredibly lightweight camera, very easy to carry around. Now, insofar as I could tell, this is the first camera released to market with full shutter priority capabilities. If I'm wrong, I'm fairly certain I'll be corrected about that in the comments before too long, but that is, insofar as I could tell, that was the case. Now, the Agfamatic, or Optima 1A, was made by Agfa in Germany from 1962 until the 1970s, reportedly. I couldn't confirm the time that it went out of production independently. It was preceded by the Optima 1. It was concurrent with many Agfas, including the 2, 3, 2S, 3S, and more. There are a lot of Agfa cameras, and some of them have fairly fuzzy production timelines, just because of the quality of records that are out there for them. It was followed by, well, I don't know. I couldn't really identify a direct successor to this camera, and by the time that this camera was reportedly discontinued, this type of camera would likely have fallen out of favor anyway, so it's a distinct possibility that nothing really directly followed this. There could very easily not have been another automatic viewfinder camera released by Agfa after this one. So if you have your Agfa Optima or Agfamatic 1A, we're going to go over all the features now. We'll talk next about what they are, and throughout the course of this video, we'll talk about what they do. Now you might notice there are no strap lugs, and that was to help ensure that you purchased the camera's case. I'm going to guess those didn't come with it, but I could be wrong. It might have come with the case. So the case has the camera strap, not the camera itself. Here's the film rewind knob and lever. This is what you would use to rewind your film when you're done. The hot shoe right here, which allows you to mount a flash and fire it with the camera. Your DIN and ISO, ASA and ISO, of course, as I said, the same thing. Selection dial right here. That is a cable release for your shutter. Film advance lever right there. On the front of the camera, we have the shutter button, light meter, Agfa badge, viewfinder window, and then the lens. On the lens, we saw already the selection for the focus right here. This front ring is your focus. Then we have here, this should give you a slightly better view of it, this ring that currently has that notch pointing to A. This is your camera's mode dial. So that A stands for automatic. And if you are in that mode, the camera will fire at 1/160th of a second and pick the best aperture for the amount of light as determined by the selenium cell light meter. Okay, but you're not in A. There are two other settings here. This one right here you can see has a flash symbol. If you're going to use a flash, you're going to be over here. This one over here has a green B. That is probably very, very hard to read on the video. That's a B. If you want to use bulb mode, you're going to be over here. So let's start with the flash. The flash here shows 2, 8, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, and 16 and 22. Those are your aperture numbers, and it is stepless in between those as well. So if you're going to use a flash, the camera's shutter is going to fire at 1/30th of a second, and whatever you set this aperture to is what the camera will stop down to. So if you're going to be using a flash with this camera, you will need to use a manual flash with manual power settings, and then you'll want to learn how to calculate the guide number and distances and use a manual flash in that way, and then select the proper aperture for your flash powers and your subject distance. For your flash's power and the subject's distance. Over on the bulb side here, we have the exact same thing but in green, and it shows all of the apertures from 2.8 to 22, and basically this is going to be your bulb shutter speed. So when you, dang it. So when you pick an aperture, what's going to happen is that in bulb, you hold the shutter button down and the lens, the leaf shutter will open. And then you can see here as I adjust the aperture, I hope that it opens and closes. Nope, did not like that. Yeah, it's opening and closing. Okay. So you might be able to see the aperture opening and closing there. And basically, what you would do in bulb mode is you would pick the aperture you want to use, and then you would hold down the shutter or use a locking cable release, and then just take your bulb exposure. I suppose theoretically if you had a long enough exposure and you wanted to experiment with sliding through the aperture range while you took that photo, you could probably get away with trying that with this camera. That would potentially be an interesting effect and experiment. Okay, anyway, that's what's on the lens. On the camera's back, we have the viewfinder window right here and the film rewind release button right here. We'll see how to use that when we load film. On the camera's bottom, we have the tripod socket and the film back release, which we will unlock so that we can take the back of the camera off and look inside of the camera. This is the film cassette chamber where you will put your fresh film to load it. Shutter box, film guide rails right here. So these outer ones keep the film from moving up and down as it travels through the camera. And then these inner ones sandwich against the film pressure plate here, which we'll see in just a second, to keep the film flat as it travels through the camera. This is the film tension sprocket, and the film tension sprocket works by spinning this way only the direction of the film take-up spool when you advance the camera like that. And because it has sprockets on both sides, it pulls on the film evenly and helps ensure that it proceeds smoothly through the camera. This is the film take-up spool right here, and this pulls the film through the camera and takes it up as it's being used. You'll notice the film tension sprocket here does not roll backwards. If you hit the film rewind release button, now it spins freely. And what this does is this disengages the gearing within the camera so that the film can be rewound without breaking the film as you pull it through the camera. There we go. Okay. On the camera's back, right here, we have the film pressure plate, which is what keeps the film flat as it goes through the camera. And then this roller meshes up with the film tension sprocket to help ensure that there's proper tension on the sprocket from the holes in the film. These holes, by the way, are coincidentally called sprocket holes. So what we're going to do to load the film is we're going to grab it here and we're going to slide it into the film cassette chamber. And we're going to get it nested like that, and we're going to pull out a leader, which we are going to feed into the film take-up spool. And if we don't do it correctly, the film cassette will just pop right out. There we go. Let's try that again. I'm going to advance. I'm just going to make sure that it's being taken up, and it is. There we go. We're going to grab our film back. Going to put the film back into place and lock it. Okay, there we go. That's securely put into place. Now, where's the frame count window? Oh, there's the frame count window. I missed it. It's over here on this side. What I'm going to do is you can see the arrow there that indicates the direction of the frame count window. I'm going to set this to that triangle. Yeah, actually we're not, because this is for 36 frame. Actually, we are going to try to set that to the triangle, aren't we? Let's see, does this count up or down? It counts down. Okay. So because this one counts down, we're just going to keep turning this until we get to 26. Because this is a 24 exposure roll. If you were using a 36 exposure roll, you'd leave it at that red triangle. Now we're going to advance it until it says 24. And now we have properly advanced our film. Next, we need to make sure that we set the ASA or DIN to the correct number. We are using 200. So there we go. We're just going to line up 200 with, there's an almost imperceptible little notch right here. But as long as 200 or your film's speed, whatever you're using, is in the center of that window, you'll be in pretty good shape. We're just going to take a little bit of slack out of that. And if you watch this knob, this rewind knob here, when I advance the film, you can see that it spins. So you know your film's being taken up if the film rewind knob spins when you are advancing the film through the camera, just like that. Okay. And you can also see here, as we've gone through, the frame counter is counting down. Let's see if I can get you a better view of that. Okay. So the reason that this spins when the film is advanced is because there's a mechanical connection in the film, and it's being taken up on the film spool over here, which pulls it out of the cassette across the back of the camera. And then the cassette has little teeth in here that grip with the forks of the film rewind knob, so that when you rewind it, it actually does its job to rewind. So that is why that happens. Now, film is one and done. You can use it a single time in a controlled manner with a proper shutter speed and aperture to record an image, or in an uncontrolled manner where it will absorb all of the photons that reach it and become completely useless by doing this. So in the real world, with film that you actually care about, you do not want to open the film back. You're not going to be able to see the photos you've taken. If you open the film back, you are in fact going to just erase all of the photos that are on your film. But I do want you to see what's going on inside of the camera as we advance the film. So we activate the shutter, and then when we advance the film, you can see that it's pulled out of the cassette and fed through the camera. There we go. And now, if we try to rewind it, I'll use my finger to replicate that little tensioner thing on the film back. You can see that it's not being able to be rewound because the film tension sprocket is there. So when you finish your roll of film, you want to slide this down. Again, you want to keep the film back on. That is important to have on all of the time when you have film in the camera. That you slide the film rewind switch down, and now you just rewind your film. And that sound that you probably just heard as the film came off of the take-up spool is audible outside of the camera. So that lets you know you're almost done. In real life, using a real roll of film, you would want to rewind this entire leader back into the camera. However, I'm going to be reusing this film, so I need to leave a leader for myself so I can use it later in other videos. But basically, you'd rewind the film into the camera, and then you'd send it off to the lab. If you leave a leader like this, then it's very easy to say, oh, I haven't used this roll of film yet, and then run it through a camera a second time and probably ruin both sets of shots. So after you've removed your film, you can grab another roll of film and put it in, or if you are done shooting for the day, just set your film off to the side. Put the camera bottom back on, lock it in place, and then run through a couple of exposures to get the gearing engaged again. And then, of course, trigger your shutter when you're done for the day so that you take all the tension off of the spring mechanism. Flash use is limited to the hot shoe, so you will need a flash that can be powered by the hot shoe. Now, this will use an X flash bulb, which is the modern kind of flash. Anything you could buy at your local camera store is going to be a xenon strobe, and that will work in this camera. The flash sync speed is only 1/30th of a second, and the only exposure control you have is with the aperture selection when you're shooting with a flash. You can also, I would recommend, if you do want to use a flash with this camera, get one with manual controls. It could be a 1980s Vivitar 283 or 2500, something like that, or it could be a brand new like Yongnuo. As long as you can control the flash power, you will be set up to be able to control your flash brightness and exposure on this camera. So some basic, well, you're really, unless you get an RF adapter or a cable adapter, you're pretty much limited to setting your flash on top of your camera. The worst place for a flash is on top of your camera. If this studio light is your flash, what happens when you take a picture is the flash leaves your light, reaches your subject, bounces back down to the lens, and when it goes into the lens, what happens is that your subject will look flat and waxy. It's not a good look for anybody, or any subject for that matter. You want to use your flash to replicate the lighting conditions that people consider normal. If you look at somebody outside, we're underneath the sun. If that's at night, they're underneath a street light. If you're indoors, they're underneath overhead lighting. Our brains are hardwired to think of things that are lit from above as looking natural, and that's what we see as flattering. So to do that with a strobe, you want to get a strobe with an articulating head. So one that you can point up at the ceiling, or even better, one that you can rotate around, so that you can use some creative lighting controls. But the big thing you want to do when using a flash is simulate natural lighting to the greatest extent possible. And to do that with a flash, bouncing it up to the ceiling, down to your subject, back to your lens, will set your subject up to have the most flattering light that you can give them with a flash that's mounted on top of a camera. Next thing let's do is talk about how to take a photo with this camera. It's designed for it. It's a very, very simple process. So what you'll want to do is select your mode first. In general, for most shooting, you will just leave it at A. That's what you're going to set it at. There aren't too many other options. You'll want to select your focus point. Okay, there we go. Now let's say, for instance, you are outside and you know that the light meter is going to be wrong because you're in complex conditions, like you're taking a picture of your friend under an awning with a bright beach in the background. What you can do then is manually override your aperture by going into your flash setting and picking an aperture that is very, very small, and or maybe slightly larger, depends on what you need for your specific lighting conditions, and then use 1/30th of a second as your shutter speed for that. But in general, you're going to leave this in automatic mode. Select the focus point that you want. Okay, that's the focus point that we want. And then making sure that your hand, or your finger rather, is not in front of the selenium cell meter, because this will absolutely mess up your exposure. You just take a picture, and you have taken a picture with this camera. Okay, well, and don't forget also you want to sight up your framing in the viewfinder. That's pretty easy. What about double exposures? Well, you can, in, I guess, the same way that you can take a Ford Pinto and jump it over like 3 other cars. It's possible. It's not a good idea. So the reason for that is that if you're going to take a double exposure, you are limited either to 1/30th of a second or bulb, which means you're either using your double exposure capability indoors in low light or with an ultra, ultra slow film. In automatic mode, you cannot, well, that's not true. You can kind of compensate a little bit. So let's say, I'm going to show you how to do a double exposure in automatic mode here. Let's say you're using 100 ISO film. Okay. If you're using 200 ISO film, you cannot do this trick, by the way. So if you're using your 100 ISO film, we're going to trick the camera into doing a double exposure with us. Now, the science behind the double exposure is that if you have a shutter speed of 1/160th of a second, and f5.6 is a proper aperture for a proper exposure, You do that once, you end up with a proper exposure. If you do that twice, you end up with twice as much light as the film is supposed to have, which is going to give you what's called a thick, dark, or dense negative. Those are three words that mean the exact same thing. The film received too much light. The negative will be very dark. That reduces your contrast when you are printing or digitizing. It increases your darkroom printing time significantly, and it also will increase your digital noise when you digitize it if you do that. So those are three drawbacks to putting too much light onto the film. So if you're using 100 ISO film and you want to use a double exposure, the first thing we're going to do, and you're using automatic mode, the first thing that we're going to do is trick the camera into giving us the proper amount of light for a double exposure. And we do that by turning the ASA or ISO dial to a film that is one stop faster. We have 100 ISO film loaded. We need to go to 200 ISO. And that's why it is, by the way, that anything faster than 100 ISO you cannot do a double exposure with and have it reliably turn out well. So now the camera thinks we've got 200 ISO film in it. 1/160th at f5.6 is proper with 100 ISO. 1/160th at f8, which is half as much light reaching the film, would be a proper exposure at 200 ISO. So we take the first shot of our double exposure. The film is half exposed. The next thing we need to do is prevent the film from advancing when we rearm the shutter. So we're going to hold the film knob in place. We're going to hold the film rewind button or lever down, which I'm actually going to do this way. That'll work. And now we're going to advance the film. Doing this will keep the film from being advanced, keep your gears from being ruined when you take the image, and rearm the shutter. Now what we can do is set up our second shot, take a picture, and the second shot will have been underexposed by one stop. 2 images underexposed by one stop gives you a proper double exposure. Now what we need to do, if we're not going to shoot any more double exposures, the first thing we're going to do before we forget is restore our film ISO or DIN to the correct number, because we don't want to go around half exposing the rest of the roll of film. Next thing we have to do is take a dead frame. So to take a dead frame, we're going to slide this over here to f22 on the flash side, put our hand over the lens, unless you have a lens cap. Gotta rearm the shutter. Take a photo, and now we advance the film. The reason we do the dead frame is because after your double exposure, when you start advancing the film, the gearing doesn't engage instantly. So you can start advancing the film, and then your double exposure will only advance partway across the shutter opening. Maybe halfway, maybe 80% of the way, it doesn't matter. Some amount of the double exposure is likely to be in that shutter opening, which means when you take your next image, they're going to overlap. It could potentially ruin both photos. So you take the dead frame to protect the work that you did in your double exposure and ensure that it isn't ruined by your next photo. And then go about to taking photos as you normally would for the rest of your day. One thing to note about this camera, it does have a very quick uptake after re-engaging the film advance. So if you do some double exposures and you find there is not that you don't need a dead frame, it's possible that you don't have to have one with this camera, but it is definitely still, I still recommend doing it at least as you are practicing and learning before experimenting with whether or not you actually need to do one. So an interesting thing about this camera, it reportedly had the longest production run of all of the Optima Agfamatic cameras, and the higher end cameras in that lineup received updates and design changes to be made to look like they were more Japanese, because at the time, Japanese cameras were in favor. So the Agfa did not want them looking like German cameras. I also do not know of any way to tell when these were made between 1950, whatever it was, and the 70s, whenever they went out of production. But they do seem to be very reliable still. The reports of these all still, or generally still working well, are pretty consistent. So I'm very impressed by the fact that the selenium meter on this camera still works however old it is. Also, one other thing about this camera is that apparently even in automatic mode, the aperture is stepless. So some things not to do with your camera. Don't store the camera with the shutter ready to fire. So whenever you're done for the day, trigger the shutter. And the reason for that is because this is all clockwork. So when the shutter is armed by the advance lever motion like that, it puts a bunch of springs under tension. And if those springs stay under tension, they'll become fatigued and weak. That can affect your shutter's timing. It can affect your shutter's operation, and it can also potentially lead to those springs breaking, which will render your shutter unusable. Don't leave your camera or lenses in your car because there are lubricating oils in the shutter mechanism that can get really thin if they get hot and get into places they shouldn't be. And then when they get cooled down and get back to their proper viscosity, they will prevent your camera from operating properly. If you leave it out there in the cold, those lubricating oils can get thick and gummy if they break down in the cold, and that can also affect your camera's ability to operate. Don't store your camera in a plastic bag or box unless you have a really good rechargeable desiccant pack, because that plastic is permeable. So if moisture gets into the plastic, then it can get trapped there. And moisture can go through the plastic, but once it gets into a space, it's more likely to stay there. That can cause mildew to grow in your covering and fungus to grow in your optics, corrosion to occur in your light meter, which would render it useless, and basically lots of things can happen that can ruin your camera. Don't let your camera get wet. It's not weather sealed. All of the mechanical components are metal, and they can rust and rust together, which would ruin your camera. And just remember that your Agfa Optima or Agfamatic 1A is a precision tool that should be handled with care and respect. As long as you take care of your camera will take care of you. Thank you for watching this video. Please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track producing content which is useful and helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about checking these every couple of days and answering questions. If you have any suggestions or ideas for future videos, and if I have the technical know-how and equipment, I'm more than happy to make those. One last thing. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. I gotta get up, Steinbeck. I have to turn off the camera.